Alberts Bridge Books presents The 38 Steps, an Eli Marks short mystery written by John Gaspard, read by Jim Cunningham. Has there ever been a 4 a.m. phone call that was good news? Possibly. Like being awakened from a sound sleep to be told you've won the Nobel Peace Prize. But even then, I'm sure there are plenty of Nobel laureates who would have happily waited until a more reasonable hour to receive such delightful information. From the moment I was rudely awakened, I had no reason to think this call was from the Nobel Committee or that it would be delightful, and the ringtone supported that belief. It was from my ex-wife. After I'd gotten remarried, I had switched her tone from a song snippet, the Rolling Stones' It's All Over Now, to a more discreet yet still distinctive ring. The settings on my iPhone informed me the tone I selected was technically called Old Phone. Whoever was in charge of naming ringtones had nailed it on that one. It sounded exactly the way phones did when Deirdre and I had first met. So it seemed a fitting choice for her blessedly infrequent calls. "Sorry to bother you so early," she said after I finished fumbling and finally answered. Yet her manner didn't suggest she was in the least bit apologetic. That would have been out of character for Deirdre. She's no nonsense times 10. "Fred needs to talk to you." The Fred she was referring to is her newish husband, homicide detective Fred Hutton. She had hyphenated when they'd gotten hitched, giving her a moniker that always made me smile. Assistant District Attorney Deirdre Sutton Hutton. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Then why didn't homicide detective Fred Hutton place this call? My voice came out thicker than anticipated. I think I was clinically still asleep. He thought it was too early. He was right, and yet you clearly felt no such compunction. Not in the least. And why did your husband feel this need, albeit via surrogate, to call me? There's a body in the morgue that came in overnight, a John Doe, she said. Fred took a look through the guy's pockets. We think he may be a friend of yours. How do you figure? It will make more sense once you're here. Sure thing. How does noon sound? I'll see you in 30 minutes. Before I could generate the beginnings of an argument, she had already hung up. I set the phone down as I struggled to sit up. What was that? Megan's voice came from deep within her pillow. I have to go to the morgue. Do we need anything? At the morgue? What do you mean? You're dreaming. Go back to sleep. I didn't have to suggest this twice. Before I'd even found my pants, she was already snoring quietly. Although there had been talk for years about moving the crowded Hennepin County morgue from downtown Minneapolis out to the suburbs, that relocation had yet to occur. The drive was simple and straightforward. There was no traffic to speak of at this hour, and parking was plentiful. I had to ring the bell to gain entrance to the old two-story building. Once I was buzzed in, I nearly ran right into Deirdre. You made good time. It helps if 99% of all drivers are home and asleep. What did you want me to see? By way of response, Deirdre turned and headed down a dimly lit corridor. Her heels made a clacking sound that echoed annoyingly through the building, although I imagine most of the occupants didn't really care one way or the other at this point. I scurried to catch up. Around midnight, someone discovered a body on the bike path which runs around Lake Harriet. The victim appeared to have fallen down the stairs, the ones that lead down from Penn Avenue. I know those stairs. They're like the stairs from The Exorcist, only scarier. They're really steep and deadly. Well, they certainly were last night. She made a sharp right into a large and under-illuminated office. Through glass windows in the back of the room, I could see a brightly lit exam room. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton was in conversation with a stern-looking woman in a white lab coat. So is this considered a homicide? Deirdre shrugged. Right now, it's in that fuzzy gray area. For the time being, we're calling it a suspicious death. It would help if we knew who he was. And you think I knew him? The district attorney's office has its suspicions, came a booming, if dull, voice. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton had stepped into the room. He was holding a plastic evidence bag. We in homicide aren't yet quite as persuaded. The only thing they found on the guy was a small silk coin purse, Deirdre said, as she gestured at the item in the bag her husband was holding. After a nod from her, he pulled it out and placed it in the palm of his gloved hand. I'm not familiar with that coin purse, I began, but Deirdre held up a silencing hand. The detective snapped the purse open and pulled out a single coin. Even from a few feet away, it was pretty clear what it was. And I certainly don't recognize that quarter, I said. 40 minutes ago, I had been sound asleep, and now I was here and didn't know why. Irritated didn't begin to cover what I was feeling. Turn it over, Deirdre instructed. Her husband did as he was told. I leaned in closer. It's a quarter with writing on it. Those are your initials, Deirdre said. E and M in black magic marker. Okay, I'll give you that. But surely there are other people with the initials EM, I said. E.M. Forrester comes immediately to mind. Edvard Munch, Ethel Merman, E.G. Marshall when he was in a rush, Ed Marlowe. Who's Ed Marlowe? A friend of my Uncle Harry's from Chicago, I explained, a terrific magician. Actually, he called himself a cardician because he mainly worked with playing cards. You know that one move I do, the snap change? He developed that along with, it's your initials, she said sharply, cutting me off. I recognized them. I certainly saw them enough on legal documents. I looked down at the coin again. The letters did have a familiar aura to them. From the mortgage on our house, right? We must have initialed those things 50 times. I was thinking more of the divorce papers, she said. It's a more indelible memory. But regardless, those are your initials. And I know you do at least one trick which requires someone to put their initials on a quarter. I certainly saw it enough. Well, then, perhaps you might recall that in that trick, I get the spectator to put their initials on the coin, I said, feeling myself slipping right back into our standard argument format. I resisted the urge to dive in head first. It would hardly be all that magical if I make it disappear and reappear with my own initials on it. Following that logic, I might as well go ahead and sign my own name on all my playing cards. I understand that, Deirdre snapped. She took a cleansing breath and continued. There must have been a point when someone else did the trick for you and you signed the quarter. I have no memory of anyone ever doing a trick for me that involved a signed quarter. Well, maybe not, but it certainly must have been memorable for this guy. This came from Homicide Detective Fred Hutton, who had been watching us impassively. The victim kept it in a very expensive coin purse, and he had it on him when he died. In fact, it was the only thing he was carrying. That traditionally suggests there was a strong sentimental value attached to the object. Eli, they've run fingerprints and facial recognition on this guy, and they're coming up with nothing, Deirdre said. She wasn't pleading with me, but she was getting as close to it as she was ever likely to get. Can you recall any instance when you signed a quarter with your initials for someone? I was about to say no, but then I was hit with a sudden memory. There had been one instance. I was doing a trick with a sugar packet, Very Sweet by David Gabay, and I asked my spectator for a quarter. He said that not only did he not carry money, but he also made a point of never, ever signing his name to anything. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it earlier. He was more than just memorable. He was absolutely terrifying, and he was also the best audience for magic I'd ever had. I know who it is, I said. Mr. Lime? Deirdre repeated. but I thought he didn't exist. I looked down at the corpse on the table in front of me. Well, he doesn't exist anymore, but this is definitely him. He was covered by a sheet with only his head visible, but I recognized him instantly. Pale, nearly translucent skin pulled tightly around his skull, gray hair speckled with gray, if that was even possible. His mouth was closed, and mercifully so were his eyes, but if his thin lips had been peeled back, I'm sure his teeth would be just as yellow as the last time I'd seen him. When was the last time I'd seen him? I certainly remember the first time. I'd been tricked into thinking I was heading into a gig at a mansion on Lake of the Isles, only to find myself performing for a creepy old man in a dark and mammoth living room. A handful of other encounters followed, each more terrifying than the last. It wasn't that he ever threatened me personally. It was, instead, the persistent feeling that things would be very negative for anyone who happened to find themselves on his bad side. "Why did you call him Mr. Lime again?" Deirdre said. "It was the name he gave himself," I explained. "He liked old movies. He didn't want to give me his real name. He was a fan of The Third Man, and I think thought of himself like the Orson Welles character in the film, Harry Lime, a charming, immoral monster." "So you don't know his real name?" Homicide Detective Fred Hutton was leaning on a nearby counter. I shook my head. "No, and I don't know where he really lived or what his business really was. Not for sure." "But you think he was involved in criminal activity?" Deirdre asked. "It sure seemed like it," I said. "I know he hired Dylan LaSalle at one point to act as a drug mule." "We never found any proof of that," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton said. "As you told me at the time, repeatedly," I said. "And although he knew all about the death of that film projectionist, I don't think he was personally involved. In fact, I got the sense that he wasn't personally involved in anything. Like he was a puppeteer, managing events but never getting his hands dirty." "They got plenty dirty tonight," Deirdre said dryly. I looked down at the delicate corpse on the table in front of me. Mr. Lime had always seemed simultaneously both tiny and immensely imposing. Not a bad trick if you can pull it off. "Was he dead before he went down the stairs?" Deirdre shrugged. "It's unclear, but he was absolutely dead by the time he hit the bottom," she said. "I wish I could help you," I said, "but I have literally told you everything I know about the guy." I pulled the sheet back up over his head, but it didn't really work. Even completely covered, I couldn't stop seeing that terrifying face. The sun was just coming up as I headed home. The day was threatening to snow, but like it had the last few days, it felt like another empty threat. Megan had been disappointed we'd had no snow for our recent Thanksgiving dinner, but Harry had been quick to put a positive spin on it. "The trouble with snow on Thanksgiving," he'd said, "is that by the time mid-January hits, it feels like we've had snow forever. It makes for a long, cruel winter. Count your blessings and pass the potatoes." I'd opted to take the scenic route home from the morgue, circling around the chain of lakes which dominate the landscape in South Minneapolis. This circuitous path eventually led me around Lake Harriet, which inevitably took me to Penn Avenue. Without even really thinking about it, I pulled the car over and shut off the engine. From my position behind the wheel, I could just see the top of the stairs which cut down the steep hill to the lake below. I sat there for a while, not really sure why I had taken this longer route home. And then, still not sure why, I got out of the car and crossed the street. I stood for several seconds at the top of the precipitous concrete staircase. The comparison with the famous steps from The Exorcist was a good one, but with one key difference. The steps in Georgetown at least have the civility to include a couple of lights. By contrast, The stairs leading from Penn Avenue down to Lake Harriet offered no such helpful illumination. Even with the sunrise nearly complete, the long, hard stairway was dimly lit and shadowy. The fact that no crime scene tape obstructed the top or the bottom of the steps drove home the idea the Minneapolis Police Homicide Division wasn't convinced a wrongdoing of any kind had occurred here. Yet, I couldn't imagine a reasonable scenario for a frail and wobbly old man to decide that midnight would be an ideal time for a quick jog around the lake, and that this treacherous stairway was the most efficient way to get there. I started down the steps, taking generous advantage of its cold handrail to ensure my otherwise precarious balance. After 10 steps, I began to wonder why more people hadn't tumbled down this particular stairway. The narrowness of the steps and their uneven spacing certainly made falling the most likely outcome. As I reached the 20th step, I realized I was counting. I wasn't sure why, but I kept at it, carefully navigating the incline until I reached the safety of the bottom. Although safety was a relative term. The steps emptied out onto a bike path and offered limited visibility prior to that final step. Luckily, no bicyclists were currently on the pathway, which gave me a moment to turn and look back up the steep slope. 38 steps. That was the number of concrete stairs Mr. Lime had tumbled down. Did he fall or was he pushed just a few hours before? 38 steps. Why did that phrase stick in my head? My brain was suggesting it was familiar without giving me any further clues as to why. And then I figured it out, and I felt strangely sad for Mr. Lime. This might have been the first time I ever had. As a fanatical film fan, he would have likely been intimately acquainted with Alfred Hitchcock's early film, The 39 Steps. Even knowing him as little as I did, I suspected it might actually have been a favorite of his. Would he have enjoyed the irony of missing that goal by merely one step? Had he been able to count the stairs on his way down, silently wishing for one more small bit of concrete before landing with a fatal thud at the bottom? Or was he already dead before he began his journey down these lethal stairs? I looked up at the long flight. There was bright sun visible at the top, but precious little illumination for the majority of the stairway. If I was thinking that this might be a visual metaphor for the answers I would be discovering in the days and weeks ahead, a light at the end of a shadowy tunnel, I was sadly mistaken. There would be no light at the end of this mystery. At that moment, I knew just about all I would ever know about the odd death of an even odder man. That didn't mean I didn't think about it. I certainly did. I had plenty of other thoughts to occupy my mind over the next couple of weeks, but the death of Mr. Lime on those 38 steps was a frequent visitor. I was never able to reach any sort of satisfying conclusion, though. Just a series of random images from our limited encounters mixed with the memory of his body in the morgue and his final journey down those deadly steps. "Are you still pondering that staircase, Death?" Uncle Harry asked. "Because you certainly aren't in the here and now." Currently, the here and the now consisted of the back room of Chicago Magic, the shop Harry had founded and which I was attempting to keep on life support. He agreed to spend an afternoon with me, sorting through the mountains of stuff which had accumulated over the years in the storage area behind the store. "There's plenty of treasure back there," he had said on more than one occasion. Over the next few hours, I hoped to determine the veracity of that statement. I also wanted to clear out all the junk, which my gut told me made up the majority of the alleged prized inventory. I don't know why his death sticks with me so much," I said. "It's a puzzle I just can't solve." "Are you becoming like our friend, Mr. Strickland?" Yikes! I certainly hope not. I wouldn't wish that fate on anyone. Mr. Strickland was something of a legendary customer in the magic shop. He wasn't, as far as we could tell, a practicing magician, not an amateur nor a professional. To the best of my knowledge, he did not belong to either of the rival magic clubs in town. In all the years he'd been coming into the store, I don't believe I'd ever seen him perform even one trick. Yet he bought tons of magic from us. Strickland appeared to have a singular goal: to find out how a trick was done. Period. That was the end of his interest in the illusion, regardless of how much he'd spent to get that information. He demonstrated zero interest in performing it. He was, in all recorded cases, merely after the secret. Uncle Harry, who has hard and fast rules about selling magic before a magician is ready to perform it, had long ago given up on Strickland. "The man is a lost cause," Harry used to say. "The man is your best customer," I'd respond. "There's nothing saying he can't be both." And Strickland probably was the shop's best customer. Over the years, he'd likely purchased more tricks than any 2 or 3 magicians in town combined. The arrival of the internet and online shopping did not appear to slow Strickland down. He lacked the patience to wait for FedEx or UPS to provide the answers he wanted. Nor did he trust the alleged answers provided on YouTube. Our shop was only a short drive away, and so, credit card in hand, he'd make the trip and have his answer in mere moments. It is not uncommon, after a customer purchases a trick, for Harry or me to demonstrate the secret for them, only after cash had exchanged hands, of course. While tricks generally come with written or video instructions, we felt it improved customer relations to help the buyer launch the new trick as quickly as possible. Plus, magic instructions can sometimes be famously opaque. We'd stopped offering this service for Strickland early on, as it was soul-crushing to explain a trick's clever secret and then have the customer merely grunt, nod, and walk out of the store. On more than one occasion, he didn't even bother to take the trick with him. So in his case, it was our practice to merely sell him the trick and make him actually have to watch a video or read a sheet of instructions. "No, I'm not becoming Strickland, not to worry," I said. I could tell I was trying to convince Harry as much as myself. "Eventually, I'll stop thinking about it." True to my word, I did just that for about 45 minutes. And then the sound of the bell over the shop door brought me back to reality. I pushed my way through the curtain from the back room, expecting to see a familiar face of some kind, a magician/customer, or my friend Nathan, or even the mailman. Instead, I saw a face that frightened me nearly as much as Mr. Lime's visage. It was Mr. Lime's assistant, his driver, his who knows what else, the man he had nicknamed Harpo. I think I audibly gulped when I saw him standing in the doorway. He looked the same as he had on the handful of occasions I'd seen him in Mr. Lime's company, a squat and muscular man, the human equivalent of a fire plug, with a neck nearly equal to the width of his shoulders. A tightly trimmed hedge of red hair covered his apparently flat head. As with all of Lime's movie-themed nicknames, there was a hint of truth to the moniker he'd assigned to the man. He'd called me Mandrake, after the comic book and early movie character. We were both magicians, so that made a certain sense. In the case of his assistant, the resemblance to the famous comedy film star ended at the fact they were both silent at all times. I'd never noticed any of the warmth and playfulness of Eli Marks in this man. Just the opposite, in fact. He projected a nearly palpable air of impending violence. His silence only increased that threat tenfold. We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, I asked the question which was hanging in the air between us. "So you heard about Mr. Lime?" He nodded. Another pause. "Was it an accident?" He shook his head. "Do you know how it happened?" He nodded. I couldn't figure out how to phrase my next question, and part of me really didn't want to know the answer, but another part did. "Have you dealt with the person or persons responsible?" He gave me a long, steady look, and then, finally, he nodded. "I see," I said. "I see." Now that I had the information, I really didn't know what to do with it. Apparently, someone had killed Mr. Lime, and his assistant had extracted a similar violent revenge. I suppose there were other ways to read that silent answer, but I wasn't seeing them. Harpo reached into his jacket pocket, and I couldn't help it. I flinched. He very, very slowly removed a white letter-size envelope from the depths of his coat. He closed the distance between us, holding the envelope out in front of him. It hovered between us for a long, awkward moment. Finally, I tentatively took it from him. The moment I did, he turned, and 2 seconds later, he was out the door. Harry must have heard the bell. He poked his head out between the curtains which separated the back room from the store. "Who are you talking to out here, Marcel Marceau?" "It was Harpo," I explained. "Mr. Lime's assistant, right-hand man, bodyguard, thug, I don't know." I weighed the envelope in my hand. Whatever was in there, it wasn't very heavy. Realizing I could easily spend the rest of the afternoon staring at it, I figured it made more sense to just get it over with. I ripped the envelope open like tearing off a Band-Aid. One quick, decisive action. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I pulled it out and read it once, quickly. I whistled, slowly, and then read it again. "What is it? A summons?" said Harry. I shook my head, still rereading the short missive, reeling a bit from the implications. "It's from a foundation," I finally said, as I handed the sheet to Harry. "This foundation has established a scholarship for 15 kids to attend a magic convention every year, covering all their costs. My favorite magic convention." "The Mandrake Scholarship," Harry said slowly. He looked up at me. "Mandrake the magician? From the comic books, the movie serials?" I nodded. That was Mr. Lime's nickname for me. I was Mandrake the magician. His silent assistant was Harpo. Dylan LaSalle was Francis the talking mule. He liked movie-related nicknames. "So it would seem," Harry said as he looked at the letter again. "Essentially, the scholarship is in your name. It's in honor of you, as it were. But you're the only one who's ever going to know that." I think that was by design. I think he wanted to give me something without actually giving me anything, overtly. I headed over to my laptop on the counter, grabbing the letter from Harry as I did. I looked at the name of the foundation in the letterhead and typed it into a search bar. Moments later, I was reading about the foundation and its work. Mr. Lime must have set up a foundation to shelter all of his income after he died. By the looks of this thing, the foundation is only about a month old. "Well, you can't get much done in a month," Harry commented. "On the contrary," I said, "if this is legitimate, they seem to be giving money to all sorts of different causes. Clean water, schools, free lunch programs, pre-K education, cancer research, and the Mandrake Scholarship. It goes on and on." "I thought you said he was a criminal." I shrugged. I got the sense that a lot of what he did was illegal and that some of it was possibly murderous. And yet, here's a foundation doing all kinds of good things. I looked over at Harry. If I didn't have any idea who Mr. Lime was before, then I'm completely baffled now. I stared at the website for a few moments longer and then shut the laptop. "Let's finish up cleaning out that back room," I said as I pushed my way through the curtains. "Maybe it was like an Ebenezer Scrooge sort of thing," Harry said. This came out of the blue about 30 minutes later. Although we'd made progress in clearing out the junk, separating the wheat from the chaff, as I glanced around, it looked like we'd hardly made a dent. It was becoming clear this was not going to be a one-day job after all. "What?" "The transformation your friend went through," Harry said, his voice coming from behind a small tower of cardboard boxes. "Like Scrooge did, with the ghost of Christmas yet to come." "You think Mr. Lime was visited by spirits?" I could hear Harry grunt in annoyance as he got up. He peered at me over the top of the boxes. No, he said. As he got older, like many of us do, he looked back at what he'd done with his life and wanted to change the narrative." He then launched into what I'm assuming was his Ebenezer Scrooge impression. "Spirit, I'm not the man I was. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows by an altered life. Oh, but tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone." "Maybe," I said slowly. "I'm just having trouble merging the two images in my mind. The guy I thought was a total villain suddenly turns out to be generous to a fault." "Maybe he became generous because of his faults," Harry offered. "He wouldn't be the first, that's for sure. So you're convinced this Mr. Lime was some sort of an underworld titan?" I shrugged. That might be overstating it, but I really got the sense that he was in charge of some sort of criminal syndicate. I pictured the steep stairs leading down to the lake and his final fateful plunge. Or at least he was in charge. Until recently. "Sounds like a classic dual reality situation to me." "Dual reality?" "Absolutely. You've certainly dealt with that enough in your act. I know for a fact that you do at least one trick that employs dual reality. The volunteer sees one result, while the audience perceives something wholly different." "I'm lost. How does this apply to Mr. Lime?" "Eli, you live and breathe paradoxes and dual realities on stage, yet seem unable to recognize them in real life," Harry said. "People are not just one thing. Like Chris Christopherson told us, most of us are partly truth, partly fiction, a walking contradiction." "You're quoting Chris Christopherson at me? What's next? Will you offer an insight discovered by the Wichita lineman?" "That was Glenn Campbell," Harry said, as he returned to sorting items from a sagging cardboard box. He looked up as he worked. "There is plenty of precedent. Alfred Nobel invented dynamite, but is now only known for the Nobel Prize. Henry Ford was no saint, but he gave us the Ford Foundation. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, the list goes on, rewriting the narrative, erasing the past by enriching the future." I stood there for a long moment considering this idea, trying to bend my mind around to this new view of Mr. Lime. Was it possible the worst person I'd ever met was also the best person I'd ever met? Snow had finally come, just in time for Christmas. Driving was slow, and finishing up my final errands had taken longer than anticipated. My last assignment had been to pick up 2 focaccia and some herb and garlic mascarpone at Broder's Deli. I wasn't sure why I decided to take the scenic route home until I found myself at the intersection of Penn Avenue and Lake Harriet Boulevard. The steps down to the lake were directly in front of me as I made a right turn. Without even thinking about it, I pulled over and parked, shutting off the car and getting out. I zipped up my jacket to my neck, wishing I'd brought a hat, as the wind off the lake was sharp and biting. I waited for a snow-covered car to slowly roll past me in the street. The driver had only cleared off the windshield, and so the vehicle looked like a slow-moving snowbank. Once it passed, I headed across the street. The snow was silent beneath my feet, still being in that fresh, fluffy stage. The crunchy phase would come later, when the temperature dropped further. More flakes floated down, visible in the light from the street lamp, suggesting even more snow was on the way. A faded wooden barrier had been set across the top of the steps, although it was really just a formality. The steps were dangerous in fine weather. After a couple of snowfalls, you'd have to be insane to attempt them. I stood at the top of the steep stairway and looked down into the darkness. The dim streetlight was visible by the lake, and the slope of the white snow did its best to reflect that light back, but the definition of the steps had been lost in the snowfall. Now, it just looked like a scary and badly lit ski run. I thought back to the early morning phone call from Deirdre and the visit to the morgue. Until the moment I had pulled the sheet back on his corpse, I probably hadn't thought about Mr. Lime for over a year. Yet over the last month, his name and his image kept popping up in my mind. Harry had said I was having trouble coming to grips with the paradox of the man's life, and I think he was right. I knew Mr. Lime had harmed other people, probably a lot of other people. I had slotted him in the bad guy column and let it go at that. But now I was learning there was more to him than that. It was a lesson which was having trouble adhering to my brain. I don't know why I was resisting it, but I was. Suddenly, my train of thought was interrupted. There wasn't a sound behind me, yet somehow, instinctively, I knew I wasn't alone. I turned, not sure what I was expecting to see, and was utterly surprised by the revelation. And then I saw its inevitability. It was Harpo. He was bundled up for the cold with a heavy coat and a small stocking cap pulled tightly across his wide head. "Oh," I said as I stepped back, "I didn't hear you come up." A million thoughts raced through my head, one scenario after another. My first and strongest instinct was that it had been Harpo who had pushed Mr. Lime down those 38 steps, and now he was here to do the same with me. I recognized the snowy slope might not kill me, but I was unlikely to walk away from it uninjured. Harpo merely looked at me and then stepped forward past me. He stood looking down into the darkness. He was completely motionless. And then he made the first sound I'd ever heard come out of him. He sighed. He turned and looked at me, his face as expressionless as ever. "You miss him, right?" I said quietly. He nodded. "I suppose I do too, in my own way," I said. We looked down at the white, slippery slope in front of us. Snow continued to fall, the flakes larger than they'd been just a few minutes before. "I thought I knew who he was," I continued. "Thought I had him all figured out. Thought I was an excellent judge of people, but clearly I was wrong. In death, he was benevolent and thoughtful. Did that come out of the blue? Was he always that way? Did I misunderstand his place in the world? Did I misconstrue his actions? Was he a good guy or a bad guy? Or was he both?" I took a breath. Harpo merely stared blankly back at me. "I'm not sure why I'm struggling with this to the degree I am," I continued. "I've always known that life is not black and white, that no one is 100% anything. My biggest nemesis in the magic world, Simon Hartwell, does benefit shows all the time and volunteers at the Children's Hospital. Personally, I think he's a bit of a creep, but you can't deny that's at least a little bit good, right?" Snow was accumulating atop his stocking cap, But Harpo listened patiently. "I was thinking about that coin, the quarter," I said. "The police said it was the only thing they had found on him. When did I do that trick for him? 2 years ago? 3? I remember it was in a coffee shop near the magic store. It was snowing then as well." Harpo nodded. "All this time later, and he was still carrying that coin around," I continued. "Of all the things he accumulated in his life, he felt the need to carry that one thing with him. Why was it that important to him? What did it symbolize?" I looked down the snowy slope in front of us. The stairs, all 38 of them, were entirely obscured. I know it's completely self-centered of me, alert the media, a self-obsessed performer, but part of me thinks that maybe, just maybe, I might have made a difference to him. I might have steered him toward this end-of-life beneficence. Maybe something I said or did made an actual difference. I turned to Harpo. He was still patiently listening. The snow landing on his face was starting to melt, making it look like he was crying. But of course, that wasn't possible. "It's a silly thought, I know," I said, "but that's what I keep thinking." Harpo continued to look at me without blinking. And then he did something I'd never expected him to do. He spoke. His voice was surprisingly soft and warm. I'm not sure I'd ever had an idea of what he might sound like, but this wasn't it. I guess I thought his voice would be as tough as his demeanor, but it was just the opposite. Sometimes people surprise you. He looked at me for a long moment. He didn't exactly smile, but his scowl appeared to dissolve, if only for a moment. "Merry Christmas, Eli." And then, just as he had done in the store, he turned and quickly headed away. He crossed the street, and a large car zipped between us. When it had passed, Harpo was nowhere to be seen. "Merry Christmas," I whispered, wondering, not for the first time, if this encounter had actually taken place. I stood there for a few minutes more as the snow continued to swirl around me. And then I headed for home.